There is a version of Rick Sanchez that the show has been hiding in plain sight since 2013. Not the nihilist, not the drunk genius with the portal gun and the speech about nothing mattering. The other one, the one underneath all of that. The one who cried at his daughters, admitted he was lonely as a child, gave his better self a happy ending at the edge of the universe, and then sent a 2-letter text to a woman he cared about and waited. Season 9 premieres May 24th on Adult Swim. And everything, the death of Rick Prime, the removal of Diane from his own memory, the ant farm at the edge of space, the farming gear, the unanswered hey, has been building toward a version of Rick Sanchez that the show has never had to deal with before. A Rick with no enemy to hunt, no grief to hide behind, no philosophical cover for the mean that is still very much present. Just the man, just the family, just ordinary life standing in the space where 40 years of running used to be. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let's get into it. The lie Rick has been telling since episode 1. There is a moment in the very first episode of Rick and Morty where Rick drags a 14-year-old boy into a flying saucer at 2 in the morning, points a weapon at his head, and tells him that the universe is so big and so empty that nothing any human being does will ever matter. He delivers this with total confidence. He says it like a man who has made peace with the truth, like someone who worked through the hard stuff a long time ago and came out the other side completely fine. He is not fine. That is the thing the show has been quietly proving for 9 seasons, and season 9 is the first season where the proof is complete. The lie has run out of road. The man who built his entire personality around not caring has spent 8 years doing nothing but care. About Morty, about Beth, about the family he keeps pretending to tolerate, about the wife he lost decades ago and never once stopped grieving. Every explosion, every adventure, every drink poured at 2 in the morning in that garage laboratory has been a man running very fast from a very simple feeling. Season 9 is where the running stops. But to understand why season 9 changes everything, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to look at the lie closely because it is a good one. Rick built it carefully. The lie goes like this: nothing matters because the universe is infinite. There are infinite planets, infinite versions of every person who has ever lived, infinite timelines where every possible thing has already happened. In a universe that big, one human life, one family, one relationship, one feeling is so small it might as well be zero. So why care? Why attach yourself to anything? Why love anyone when the math of the universe makes love look ridiculous? Rick does not just believe this, he preaches it. He says it to Morty constantly. He says it to Beth. He behaves as though it is the most obvious truth in the world, and everyone around him is simply too dim to have figured it out yet. In the very first season, his best friend Bird Person reveals something about Rick's most famous catchphrase. The phrase Rick shouts constantly, the one the audience assumed was just nonsense, actually translates in Bird Person's language to, "I am in great pain, please help me." Rick announced who he was in season 1. He told everyone watching exactly what was going on underneath the performance. Then he kept performing anyway, and most people kept watching the performance instead of listening to what it meant. The reason the lie worked for so long is that Rick is genuinely brilliant, and brilliant people can build very convincing explanations for why they feel the way they feel. Rick's explanation is technically correct. The universe is enormous. Individual lives are cosmically small. These are real facts about the nature of existence, and Rick understands them more deeply than almost anyone alive because he has actually traveled across dimensions and seen how many versions of everything there are. He has watched whole planets die. He has met aliens who make humans look like ants. His understanding of how big everything is comes from direct experience, not from reading a book. But there is a difference between knowing something is cosmically small and pretending you do not love it. Rick knows both. He can only admit to one. The show makes this visible through what Rick does rather than what Rick says. Watch what he does in the moments that matter. In the first season, when Morty is genuinely threatened, not inconvenienced, actually in danger, Rick moves without hesitation. Not after a sarcastic comment, not after a speech about how nothing matters, he just moves. When Beth is in pain, Rick builds things to try to fix it. When the family is falling apart, Rick is the one who ends up holding the pieces together, usually while complaining loudly about having to do it. A man who truly believed nothing mattered would not do any of that. The most honest version of this contradiction shows up in season 1, episode 6, Rick Potion number 9. Rick makes a love potion for Morty that goes wrong and turns the entire population of Earth into monsters. The logical move for a true nihilist, someone who genuinely believed that individual lives were meaningless, would be to shrug and find a new planet. Instead, Rick tries to fix it. He works on it. He fails. And when he fails completely and the world is unrecoverable, his solution is not to abandon Morty. His solution is to find a parallel universe where both of them can continue living. He drags Morty across dimensions specifically so Morty does not have to face the consequences alone. That is not nihilism. That is loyalty. That is a man who will break the rules of reality before he lets someone he loves suffer without him. The lie is that Rick does not care. The truth, visible in every season if you watch what Rick does instead of listening to what Rick says, is that Rick cares so much it terrifies him. The nihilism is not his philosophy. It is his armor. He built it to protect himself from a specific wound, and for 8 seasons, the show has been slowly removing every piece of that armor, one layer at a time. The wound is Diane. Diane Sanchez was Rick's wife. She was killed, specifically targeted and eliminated by a version of Rick from another dimension known as Rick Prime. This happened before the events of the show. The Rick the audience has been following since the beginning is a man who has already lost the most important thing in his life before episode 1 even starts. Everything the audience sees, every adventure, every speech about the meaninglessness of existence, every drink poured in a dark garage, is the behavior of someone living in the aftermath of total devastation. This is the architecture of the lie. Rick did not develop his philosophy about the meaninglessness of life because he thought about it very hard and concluded it was true. He developed it because something happened to him that felt meaningless. Something happened that had no reason behind it, no justice to it, no explanation that made it acceptable. The woman he loved was taken from him by a version of himself who did not care about anyone, for no reason other than that he could. How do you build a life after something like that? How do you believe that love is worth it when love is what made you a target? You stop believing love is worth it. You construct a philosophy that tells you love was never worth anything to begin with, that the universe does not reward attachment, that the only rational response to an irrational cosmos is to stop asking it for things. You drink. You travel between dimensions so fast that nothing can catch you. You take your grandson on dangerous missions because the missions are loud, and loud things drown out quiet ones. This is what Rick built. And it worked, for a long time, because the mission kept him busy. Rick spent decades hunting the man who killed Diane. That hunt gave his life structure. The philosophy said nothing matters, but the hunt said, this does. He could tell himself he was just being logical, just cleaning up a problem, just eliminating a threat. But the hunt was grief. The hunt was love that had nowhere else to go. Season 7 ended the hunt. In Season 7, Episode 5, titled Unmortrican, Rick finally found the man he had spent his whole life looking for. He found Rick Prime, the version of himself who had destroyed everything. And after a brutal fight that Rick nearly did not survive, Rick Prime was dead. Rick was covered in blood. The mission was complete. He felt nothing. Evil Morty, who had helped Rick get to that moment, asked him afterward if he felt better. Rick had no answer. The family came home and returned to their lives. Rick watched them. His face showed nothing. Not relief, not peace, not the release he had been working toward for decades. Just emptiness. The man who had organized his entire existence around a single purpose had achieved that purpose, and it had not given him anything. The armor had a hole in it, and there was nothing underneath. Season 8 tried to fill that hole. Rick began to open up in small ways that would have been unthinkable in Season 1. He told Morty about having a lonely childhood. He admitted that he always wanted love from his parents. He cried watching both versions of his daughter act like children again. These are not big dramatic speeches. They are cracks. Real ones. A man letting pieces of himself show through a wall he has been maintaining for 40 years. By the time Season 8 ended, Rick had done something even more significant. He had reached into his own memory and removed the last remnants of Diane. He did this deliberately, specifically so he could move forward. And then, in a moment that is small and quiet and easy to miss, he sent a text message to the woman he had been seeing. Just 2 letters. Just, hey. After a lifetime of keeping people at arm's length, after 40 years of telling the universe he did not need anything, Rick Sanchez sent someone a text that said, hey, and waited to see if she would write back. She left it on read. That moment is funnier than it sounds. and more painful than it looks. Because it is the first time in the entire run of the show that Rick has tried, genuinely, without a backup plan, without a layer of irony to protect himself, to connect with someone new. Not because of Diane, not because of Morty, just because he wanted to. And the universe, which Rick has always said does not care, responded with silence. Season 9 starts from that silence. The lie Rick has been telling since episode 1, that nothing matters, that attachment is weakness, that a smart person does not let themselves want things, is now fully exposed. Not by an enemy, not by a cosmic event, not by Morty pulling at his sleeve, by Rick himself. He pulled the armor off with his own hands. He removed his own grief, let his own enemy die, allowed a better version of himself to go live a happy life in a memory machine at the edge of space. He did all the things a man does when he has finally decided to try. And then he got left on red. The question Season 9 has to answer is not whether Rick can change. 8 seasons of evidence says he already has. The question is, what does a man like Rick do with himself once the wall he spent 40 years building is finally down, and the thing on the other side of the wall is just ordinary life? What does the smartest man in the universe do when the problem he cannot solve is simply learning to want to be present? Season 1 Rick had a philosophy. It was a lie, but it was a useful one. It kept him moving. Season 9 Rick does not have that anymore. What he has instead is something far more dangerous to a man like him. The possibility that things could actually be okay. And nothing has ever scared Rick Sanchez more than that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The armor is gone, the mission is finished, and the grief that built his whole worldview has been deliberately removed from his own memory. All that is left now is the man underneath. But here is the problem. Rick did not get to that place alone. There is another character who was present for almost every step of that slow unraveling, who served as the emotional mirror for everything Rick refused to say out loud. And that character has been changing too. Understanding what Season 9 does to Rick's philosophy requires understanding what it does to the weapon Rick used to protect himself most effectively. That weapon has a name, and it is Morty. Section 2. What the Omega device actually did to Rick's identity. There is a weapon in Rick and Morty that never gets the attention it deserves. It does not fire bullets. It does not blow up planets. It does not send armies across dimensions or collapse timelines. What it does is quieter and, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, far more terrifying than any of those things. The weapon built by Rick Prime, the version of Rick who destroyed everything our Rick ever loved, was designed to do one specific thing. It was designed to erase a person from every dimension simultaneously. Not to kill them in one universe, while copies of them kept living everywhere else. To remove them completely. From everywhere. Forever. The weapon is called the Omega device, and what it did to Diane Sanchez, and what it did by extension to Rick's identity, is the thing that Season 9 is still living inside. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what Diane meant to Rick's philosophy. Not emotionally, philosophically. Because Rick's entire way of seeing the world, the nihilism, the detachment, the performance of not caring, was not something he was born with. It was something he built. And like any structure a person builds in response to pain, it needed something to hold it up. Diane's death was that foundation. As long as Rick was grieving, the philosophy made a kind of dark sense. Nothing matters because the thing that mattered most was taken. The universe does not reward love. Caring is a weakness that got the person he loved killed. So the logical response is to stop caring. This logic is not healthy, but it is coherent. It holds together. A man can live inside it for 40 years, which is exactly what Rick did. The Omega device did not just kill Diane, it erased her from every dimension in existence. Every version of Diane Sanchez, in every possible universe, was removed. There was no alternate timeline where Rick could eventually find a version of her. There was no parallel dimension where she was still alive and happy somewhere. Rick Prime made absolutely sure of that. He did not just take Diane away from Rick. He took the possibility of Diane away from every version of Rick who had ever existed or would ever exist. He sealed the wound so completely that not even the infinite multiverse, the thing Rick had access to that no one else did, could offer any relief. Think about what that means for a man like Rick. He has a portal gun. He can go anywhere. He has been to dimensions where time runs backward, where physics works differently, where death itself operates on different rules. The multiverse for Rick is not a theory. It is a tool he uses every day. And even with all of that, even with access to every possible version of reality, there was nowhere left in existence where Diane was still alive. The Omega device made the grief total. There was no loophole, no escape hatch, just the fact of her absence stamped across every dimension simultaneously. And here's where it gets more complicated. Because the Omega device did not only erase Diane from the universe, it also damaged the memories of her that Rick and Beth carried inside their own minds. The weapon reached into the people who loved her and corrupted the way they remembered her. Not enough to erase her completely from their thoughts. Rick could still remember that she had existed, could still feel the shape of the loss, but enough to make the memories unreliable, distorted, like trying to look at something through broken glass. This is important because Rick's grief had always been organized around a specific memory of Diane, a clear one, a version of her that he was certain about. The Omega device took that certainty away. By the time Season 8 begins, Rick cannot fully trust his own memories of his wife. He knows she existed, he knows he loved her, but the image of her in his mind has been warped by a weapon specifically designed to make sure she could never be fully held onto. Rick's response to this, over the course of Season 8, is to make a decision that no version of him would have made in Season 1, or Season 3, or probably even Season 6. He decides to remove her from his memory completely, not because he does not love her, because carrying a broken version of her is worse than carrying nothing at all. He uses a device to go into his own mind and let the last remaining memory of Diane say goodbye. In his own psyche, the memory of Diane thanks him for keeping her alive for so long. Then she is gone. This scene is very easy to watch as something sad and leave it at that. But what it actually represents, philosophically, is a demolition project. Rick has spent his entire adult life, the whole run of the show, all 8 seasons, organized around a central loss. His philosophy, his behavior, his relationships, his mission, all of it was downstream of Diane's death. Remove the memory of Diane, and you remove the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. The whole thing should collapse. And in a way, it does, which is exactly the point. The identity Rick had built was not really Rick. It was Rick after Diane. It was the person grief made him. The armor, the detachment, the nihilism, the drinking, the refusal to let anyone get close, these were not his natural personality. They were survival tools. Things a person reaches for when the thing that gave their life meaning has been ripped away, and the only alternative to shutting down completely is to build a wall and never let anything behind it again. By the end of Season 8, that wall is rubble. But here is the thing about demolishing a wall you have lived behind for 40 years. You do not automatically know who you are without it. The wall was not just protection. Over time, the wall became his personality. The detachment became a reflex. The nihilism became a default setting. Rick had spent so long being the man who did not care that he had largely forgotten how to be the man who did. Season 9 inherits this problem. There is something else the Omega device did that does not get discussed enough. Beyond the physical fact of erasing Diane, beyond the damage done to memory, the weapon delivered a specific philosophical message to Rick. It said, "The thing you loved the most was not safe. Not in this universe, not in any universe. Nowhere in the infinite multiverse was the person you loved protected from the cruelty of someone who simply did not care." The weapon proved, in the most complete and final way possible, that Rick's stated philosophy was correct. The universe does not protect what you love. Love makes you a target. Caring is dangerous. Rick could have used the Omega device as proof that he had been right all along. He could have taken the complete erasure of Diane as final confirmation that nihilism was the only rational response to existence. He did not do that. Instead, Across seasons 7 and 8, he did the opposite. He became more present, not less. He became more connected to his family, not more detached. He let Beth in. He cried. He admitted to Morty that he had been lonely as a child. He tried to start something real with Bug Ann. Every one of these choices was Rick moving toward the world rather than away from it, at exactly the moment when the evidence for retreating was at its strongest. This is the part of Rick that the nihilist reading has always missed. Rick does not respond to proof that the universe is cruel by becoming crueler. He responds by trying, tentatively, painfully, with enormous difficulty, to stay anyway. To remain present in a world that has given him every reason to leave it. That is not nihilism. It is something much harder than nihilism. Nihilism at its core is a way of protecting yourself from disappointment. What Rick is doing in the final seasons of his arc is choosing to remain open to disappointment. Choosing to try even when the evidence says it will not work. The Omega device tried to take away the last anchor of his identity. His own response to that was to start building something new, without a blueprint, in real time, while also doing everything else the show requires him to do. That is not the behavior of a man who believes nothing matters. That is the behavior of a man who is terrified that things matter very much, and who is learning, slowly, awkwardly, with a lot of damage along the way, to stop running from that terror. Now consider what Season 9 actually inherits from all of this. It inherits a Rick who has removed Diane from his memory, who has no living enemy left to hunt, who tried to open himself up to a new relationship and got left on red, who allowed a better version of himself to live a happy life in a memory container at the edge of space, essentially giving his own ghost a happy ending before wiping the memory of that too, who told his grandson about being lonely as a child, who wept with pride watching his daughters. This is not the same man who showed up drunk in a garage in 2013 and pointed a weapon at a 14-year-old boy. But the Omega device left something behind that cannot be wiped the same way memories can. It left a question. A very simple one, but one that Rick has never had to face directly, because for most of the show's run, the grief and the mission and the philosophy were all standing in front of it, blocking the view. The question is this: if the thing that made Rick who he is, the wound, the mission, the wall, is gone, then who is Rick? Not Rick after Diane. Not Rick hunting Rick Prime. Not the nihilist with a portal gun and a refusal to feel things. Who is the actual person underneath all of that? What does he want? What does he believe, not as armor, but as a genuine way of seeing the world? If someone took away everything Rick built to survive his grief and asked him to just be a person, a grandfather, a father, a man who might want to sit across from someone at dinner and actually be present, what would that look like? The Omega device did not answer that question. It just made it unavoidable. Every season before Season 9 gave Rick somewhere to put his energy that was not that question. There was always a mission, always an enemy, always a dimension to escape into. The show was very good at giving Rick exactly enough chaos to stay distracted. Season 9 is the first season that arrives after all the distractions have been removed, one by one, deliberately, mostly by Rick's own choices. He killed his enemy. He removed his grief. He let his better self go. He sent a text to a woman and got nothing back. The Omega device was a weapon designed to erase. But what it actually did, across the arc of the show, was force Rick to eventually erase himself. The constructed self, the survival self, the Rick he became because of pain, and find out what was left. Season 9 is what is left. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there is still one piece of this that has not been addressed. Because the Omega device and Rick Prime and the memory of Diane are all part of one larger story, and that story has a specific middle chapter that the rest of the show pivots on. Rick did not just lose his purpose when Diane was erased. He lost it a second time, in an even more complete way, when he finally did the one thing he had been building toward for decades. He found Rick Prime. He won. And in the moment of winning, something happened to him that no one, not evil Morty, not the audience, fully predicted. Understanding that moment is essential to understanding everything Season 9 has to deal with. Section 3. The Vengeance Engine. How Rick Prime's death left Rick philosophically homeless. Picture a man who has been running for 40 years. Not running away from something, running toward something. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. A man running away is scattered, frantic, moving without direction. A man running toward something has purpose. He has a destination. Every step makes sense because every step is bringing him closer to the thing he is chasing. The running is exhausting, but it is not meaningless. It is organized around a point. Rick Sanchez has been running toward something since before Episode 1. The thing he was running toward was Rick Prime, the man who killed Diane. The man who, by taking everything Rick loved, accidentally gave Rick the one thing a person like Rick needed more than anything else. A reason to keep going. A mission. A target. Something to aim all that intelligence and all that pain directly at, so neither the intelligence nor the pain had to sit still long enough to become something Rick could not manage. For nearly a decade of the show, that mission held Rick together. Seasons came and went, adventures piled up, the family grew and changed and got put through impossible situations. And underneath all of it, steady and unchanging, was the hunt. Rick was always hunting Rick Prime. Even in the episodes that had nothing to do with it, even in the seasons that barely mentioned it, the hunt was always running in the background, like something left on in another room. You could not always hear it, but it was always there. And then, in Season 7, Episode 5, titled Unmortrican, the hunt ended. The way it ended is important. It did not end cleanly. It did not end the way revenge stories usually end in movies and television, where the hero defeats the villain and there is a moment of catharsis. Some kind of emotional release, some sense that the scales have been balanced, some feeling of completion. Rick did not get any of that. What he got was a brutally one-sided beating of a man strapped to a chair, delivered in complete silence, with no music and no commentary, and no moment of meaningful eye contact where something important was communicated between them. Rick Prime taunted Rick the entire time. Even while being beaten to death, Rick Prime kept talking. He told Rick that killing him would not change anything. He told Rick that the two of them were the same. He told Rick that everything Rick had become in the pursuit of this revenge was proof that Rick Prime had already won, because Rick had spent his entire life becoming exactly the kind of person Rick Prime represented. Someone who let one thing consume everything else. Someone who sacrificed every other relationship and every other possibility on the altar of a single obsession. Rick did not answer. He just kept hitting. When it was over, Evil Morty asked Rick a simple question. He asked,
"How does it feel? Better?"
"No? Exactly the same?" Rick told him to leave. Evil Morty shrugged and said that vengeance always feels that way, and walked out. And he was right. Rick had done the thing he had organized his entire existence around, and it felt like nothing. Not relief, not peace, not the release of 40 years of grief finally finding somewhere to go. Just the same emptiness he had been carrying since Diane died, now with nothing left to do with itself. The family came home. They had dinner. Summer complained about something. Jerry said something that annoyed everyone. Beth moved around the kitchen doing ordinary things. And Rick sat and watched them with an expression the show had never put on his face before. A specific, hollow kind of blankness that was not his usual detachment and was not his usual performance of not caring. It was the face of a man who had just discovered that the story he had been telling himself about his own life was not true. The story was, everything will make sense when Rick Prime is dead. The grief will have somewhere to go. The mission will be complete. The purpose will be fulfilled. There will be something on the other side of this that justifies 40 years of everything. There was not. There was just Tuesday. The family having dinner. Rick sitting in a chair with nothing to hunt. The show makes this point with a specific piece of music that longtime viewers will recognize immediately. As Rick sits there and the family moves around him, the song that plays is the same song that played at the end of Season 1, Episode 6, Rick Potion number 9, when a teenage Morty had to bury his own dead body in the backyard of a parallel universe and try to pretend he was still the same person he had been that morning. It is a song about grief and loss, and the particular horror of having to keep living after something has fundamentally broken. The show played it once for Morty, in the moment Morty first understood what the universe was really like. Then it played it again for Rick, in the moment Rick understood that the universe was not even going to give him the satisfaction of feeling something when he finally did what he set out to do. The music is the show telling you directly, this is the same wound. 40 years later, a different person, but the same wound. The grief never went anywhere. The mission was just a more organized way of not dealing with it. Now, something else happened in Unmortican that deserves its own space. Because Rick did not defeat Rick Prime alone. He had help, specifically from Evil Morty, the hyper-intelligent version of Morty who had broken out of the multiverse in Season 6, and who showed up here because the Omega device threatened him as well. Evil Morty and Rick worked together to trap Rick Prime, and in the process, Evil Morty said something to regular Morty that stuck. He asked Morty whether either of them had ever stopped to think about what Rick would do after the revenge was done. He said it in his flat, knowing way, the way Evil Morty says everything, like he already knows the answer and is mildly bored by it. His implication was clear. He thought Rick would probably fall apart, maybe worse than fall apart. He had seen enough Ricks to know what happens to one when the thing holding him together is removed. What actually happened to Rick was not quite the collapse Evil Morty predicted. It was slower and stranger than that. Rick did not break down. He did not stop functioning. He went home, sat in his garage, stared at the wall, and began the long, quiet, deeply uncomfortable process of realizing that he had to figure out what he was for. This is the philosophical crisis that Unmortican created. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that comes with explosions and speeches and a clear moment where the character decides to change. The quieter and more honest kind. The kind where a person sits in a room that used to have a purpose and now is just a room, and has to work out what they are going to do with the rest of their life. The Season 7 finale then added another layer. In an episode called Fear No Mort, the show spent time inside Morty's head and revealed that Morty's deepest fear, the thing his subconscious was most frightened of, was being abandoned by Rick. After everything. After all the seasons of Rick dragging Morty through danger and using him and manipulating him, what Morty was most afraid of was Rick leaving. And the finale showed Rick being more affectionate, more open, more genuinely present than he had been in years, while Morty, unable to see it or trust it, accepted the idea of being replaceable and stopped trying to be more than that. Two characters, both changing, neither of them able to see that the other one is also changing. They keep missing each other. The show does this deliberately. It is not a mistake in the writing. It is the show being honest about how growth works in real relationships, messily, out of sync, with a lot of almost moments that do not quite connect. Season 8 then continued Rick's transformation in smaller, more specific ways. He told Morty about being lonely as a child. He admitted that he had always wanted his parents to love him more than they did. He cried in front of both versions of his daughter. He agreed to go to a family event with a woman he was seeing, something the Season 1 version of Rick would have found actively painful to consider. Each of these is a small crack in the wall. None of them alone would be enough to call a transformation. Together, across Season 8, they add up to a man who is trying. But there is a specific moment in the post-credit scene of Unmortican that is the most important philosophical statement the show made about what happens after the revenge is complete. After Rick kills Rick Prime, after the family goes home, the show cuts to a different character entirely. It cuts to the widow of Slow Mobius, a friend of Rick's who was killed during the fight with Rick Prime. She is in a bar. She is devastated. She is starting down the exact same road Rick started down decades ago. Looking for someone to blame, looking for someone to hunt, looking for a mission to organize her grief around. And then something different happens. She meets someone. A stranger at the bar who has also lost someone. They talk. Over the course of the post-credits scene, the show compresses years. They date, they build something, they raise their kids together, they keep photos of the people they lost on the wall of their home. They grieve and they also live. They do not let the loss become the mission. They let it become part of their story without letting it become the whole story. The show is telling you, as directly as it ever tells you anything, what Rick could have done differently, what the road not taken looked like. Slow Mobius's widow found in a bar conversation what Rick could not find in 40 years of interdimensional travel. She let herself be helped by the thing Rick had always been most afraid of: ordinary connection with an ordinary person in an ordinary moment. Rick watched from a chair as his family had dinner. There is no rescue scene, no moment where Rick looks at the post-credits sequence and learns from it. He does not get a neat conclusion. The show is not built that way. What it does instead is plant the image of what choosing differently could look like, and then let Rick keep living in the gap between that image and his own choices. Season 9 arrives on the other side of all of this. The mission is gone, the enemy is dead. The philosophical engine that kept Rick moving, the grief organized into a hunt, the hunt organized into a life, has run out of fuel. He has removed Diane from his own memory. He has watched a better version of himself get a happy ending. He has sent a text and gotten nothing back. What Scott Marter, the showrunner, said about Season 9 in a direct conversation with fans is telling. He said Rick still has plenty of mean left in him. That is true. But mean, for Rick, has never been the same thing as cruelty for its own sake. Rick's mean has always been directional. It pointed at things he thought were stupid, systems he thought were dishonest, people he thought were pretending. It was the cynic's edge, the part of him that refused to pretend the world was better than it was. What Season 9 has to deal with is a version of that mean that no longer has a primary target. Rick Prime is dead. The Galactic Federation has been dismantled. The Citadel is gone. The list of enemies that organized Rick's hostility has been systematically removed over 9 seasons. What remains is the hostility itself, and the question of what it does when it has nowhere specific to go. The answer to that question is the philosophical heart of Season 9. A man whose identity was built around being against things, against the universe, against meaning, against the idea that life deserves to be taken seriously, now has to figure out what he is for. Not just what he is protecting himself from, what he actually wants. What he would choose if he were not running, not hunting, not building walls. Rick Sanchez has been philosophically homeless since the moment Rick Prime took his last breath. Season 9 is him trying to figure out where to live. __quote_2___. But the vengeance engine and the grief and the empty chair at the dinner table are only half the picture. Because at the same moment Rick was losing the structure that held him together, something was happening in the show that almost nobody noticed. Something that was hiding in plain sight, quiet and patient, doing enormous philosophical work in the background of every season. It involves the one character who was there for everything, the one who watched Rick change and changed alongside him, often without either of them acknowledging it. The one the show uses as a mirror every time Rick refuses to look at himself directly. Before Season 9 can be fully understood, that mirror needs to be examined very carefully. Section 4. Memory Rick and the man Rick could have been. There is a version of Rick Sanchez who is everything our Rick refuses to be. He is warm, he is present, he shows up. He remembers birthdays and sits at dinner tables and makes the people around him feel like they are the most important thing in the room. He is passionate about the people he loves in a way that he does not hide or disguise or wrap in sarcasm. He is brave in the specific way that has nothing to do with weapons or portals or intelligence. Brave in the way that requires a person to simply be seen by someone else and not flinch from it. He is Memory Rick, and by the end of Season 8, he is living in a small, contained space at the edge of the universe with a memory of Diane, and they are happy together, and our Rick put them there and then erased the memory of doing it. The way Memory Rick exists in the show is strange and worth sitting with for a moment, because the show introduces him quietly and then makes him carry an enormous amount of philosophical weight. He is not a character who arrives with fanfare. He does not have his own episodes early on. He is just a presence, a version of Rick that got trapped inside Rick's mind a long time ago and has been living there ever since, in the parts of Rick that Rick himself refuses to visit. The origin of Memory Rick connects directly to how Rick processed his grief after losing Diane. The real Rick, the Rick the audience follows, buried his memories of Diane so deep inside himself that they became something almost separate, a version of him that still felt everything, still loved fully, still had not made the decision to shut the world out. That version got sealed away. The nihilist, the armor, the performance, those became the face Rick showed to everyone. Memory Rick was what remained of the person Rick had been before the armor was necessary. By the time Season 7 and Season 8 deal with him directly, Memory Rick has been living inside Rick's mind for decades. And in a very Rick way, what he has done with that time is try to fix things. He has been sneaking through the memories of the people Rick loves, quietly adjusting them, making them warmer and more complete. When he gets into Jerry's mind, through a connection established in Season 7 when Rick and Jerry accidentally swapped their minds, he starts filling Jerry's memories with a version of Rick who was always a good father and grandfather. A version of Rick who was present for the moments Rick missed, who showed up for things, who said the right things at the right times. Jerry, as a result, begins defending Rick, enthusiastically and without any apparent reason, from the perspective of everyone else in the family. Beth and Space Beth are baffled. Jerry is normally the person most likely to side against Rick. Suddenly, he is Rick's most vocal supporter, telling stories about things Rick did for the family that Rick definitely did not actually do. It is played for comedy, which is how the show usually handles things it wants you to think about seriously. But underneath the comedy is something genuinely moving. Memory Rick was building the life he wished Rick had lived. He was taking the empty spaces where Rick should have been, all the years Rick was absent, all the moments Rick missed because he was too busy hunting or running or drinking, and filling them with something better. He was doing, inside the architecture of other people's memories, what Rick himself could never bring himself to do in reality. This is where the philosophy gets very interesting. Memory Rick is not a separate person in any meaningful sense. He does not have a different body. He does not come from a different dimension. He is Rick. He is the part of Rick that never got the chance to make different choices, preserved like something in a jar, kept alive inside the walls Rick built around himself. Bird Person, Rick's oldest and closest friend, described Memory Rick as the best version of Rick. Passionate, loving, heroic. The kind of person Bird Person always believed Rick actually was, underneath everything else. The show has a habit of putting its most honest statements in the mouths of characters other than Rick. Bird Person has always been one of those characters. When he says Memory Rick is the best version of Rick, he is not being sentimental, he is being precise. He has known Rick longer than almost anyone. He has seen both versions, the real Rick, with all his walls and weapons and defensive cruelty, and the Memory Rick, who loved fully and showed up and made the people around him feel safe. He knows which one is closer to what Rick could have been. Season 8's finale, the episode titled Hot Rick, is where Memory Rick's story comes to its conclusion. He moves from Jerry's mind into Beth's mind, looking for any remaining trace of Diane. What he finds there, and what happens as a result, is the emotional core of the entire season. Memory Rick begins rearranging Beth's memories, not maliciously, but desperately. He is trying to rescue the memory of Diane that exists inside Beth, to bring it back to life, to give it somewhere to exist that is not just a locked room in the back of someone else's mind. The effect on Beth is devastating. Her memories begin to feel unreliable. She loses her grip on what is real and what has been added. She reaches a point where she is willing to hurt Space Beth, a version of herself, because Memory Rick's influence has pushed her to a place where her judgment is completely compromised. She nearly kills herself trying to protect the version of her childhood that Memory Rick has been building inside her. When Rick finds out what Memory Rick has done, he has to go in and stop it. What happens in that sequence is the most philosophically honest moment in Season 8. Rick goes into his own psychology, literally, inside his own mental space, and faces the version of himself he locked away. They are in the same place at the same time. The Rick who chose armor and the Rick who never got to choose differently, standing in the same room. Rick extracts Memory Rick and Memory Diane from Beth's mind. He builds them a small, contained space, described as an ant farm for memories, and he puts them both inside it. They have each other. They have a life, small and contained, but real in the way that matters to them. Memory Rick and Memory Diane are together in a quiet pocket of space, and Rick lets them stay there rather than deleting them. That decision is everything. A Season 1 Rick would have deleted them without hesitation. They were a problem. They were causing chaos. They were a version of him that he had specifically chosen to lock away, now making noise and creating damage. The logical move, the nihilist move, was removal. Clean and efficient. End the problem. Instead, Rick gives them a life. He gives the best version of himself, the version that loved without armor, the version that showed up and stayed, a small corner of the universe to exist in. He does not delete that version of himself. He does not pretend it was not real. He acknowledges it, contains it carefully so it cannot hurt the people he loves, and then lets it be. Then he removes the memory of doing so from his own mind. There are multiple things happening in that final move, and they are all worth separating out clearly. The first is an act of grief. Rick is saying goodbye to the version of himself he could have been. Memory Rick got to have Diane, even if only as a memory in a jar. Our Rick never got that. Our Rick chose the hunt, chose the armor, chose the nihilism, and spent 40 years as a consequence of those choices. Letting Memory Rick go, giving him the happy ending, is Rick acknowledging that the other road existed, that there was a version of this story where things went differently. The second is an act of protection. By removing his memory of where Memory Rick and Memory Diane are, Rick is making sure he can never be tempted to go back. He is closing the door on the past deliberately, permanently, so that the pull of it cannot become another version of the same trap he just spent 40 years inside. The grief organized into a hunt. He will not let the memory of a happy alternative become a new thing to chase. The third, and the one that matters most for Season 9, is an act of identity. Rick is not just putting away a memory. He is making a statement about who he is choosing to be going forward. Not Memory Rick, who loves fully and shows up and is everything Bird Person always believed Rick could be. But not the old nihilist either, who used grief as armor and ran from everything real. Someone in between those two. Someone who has seen both versions of himself and is now, for the first time, having to choose which parts of each to carry forward. Steve Levy, an executive producer on the show, said in a direct conversation with fans that he is excited about where Rick is heading over the coming seasons, and specifically noted that Rick has come a very long way from who he was in the pilot. That is a careful way of saying something significant. Coming a very long way does not mean arriving. It means the journey has been real and measurable. Rick is not the same person he was, but he has not yet become whoever he is going to be. Memory Rick is part of why that journey was able to happen at all. By existing, by staying alive inside Rick's mind, by continuing to feel things, by breaking out and making chaos and refusing to be silently erased, Memory Rick forced the show to deal with the question of who Rick actually was before the grief. He was a mirror of the possible. He showed Rick, and by extension the audience, that the armor was chosen, not inevitable. That there had been a Rick who existed before it was necessary. That underneath all of it, there was still a person capable of warmth. The ant farm at the edge of space is a quiet, strange, deeply Rick kind of gift. It is not dramatic. It is not a grand gesture. It is a man who cannot fully allow himself to feel things, finding the most contained, manageable, controlled way to honor the feeling anyway. Giving the memory a home. Making sure it does not disappear completely, even if he will not remember doing it. That is Rick Sanchez in the most honest version of himself. Not the nihilist, not the armor. The man who cannot stop caring, even when he is working very hard to make it look like he has. Season 9 begins without Memory Rick as a presence, without Diane in any form, without the hunt, without the armor's most important support structures. What it has instead is the man who just did all of those things. who gave his better self a happy ending and walked away, who said goodbye to the memory of his wife and chose to keep going, who sent a text to a woman and got silence back. That man is still standing. He is still drinking, probably. He is still going on adventures. Scott Martyr said directly that Rick still has plenty of mean left in him, and that is true. But the mean is operating without its usual cover now. The nihilism has lost its foundation. The philosophical engine that powered everything Rick said and did and pretended to believe has been running on empty since Rick Prime hit the floor. Memory Rick's story ended with a gift and a goodbye. Our Rick story continues without the thing that made it make sense for 40 years. Season 9 is the first season where the audience gets to see what Rick is actually like when the story he told himself about himself is no longer available to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Memory Rick is only part of the picture of what Season 8 built. Because while the finale was handling the emotional weight of Diane and Memory Rick and the ant farm at the edge of space, the rest of the season was doing something equally important. Quietly, across 10 episodes, stacking up a series of moments that showed Rick behaving in ways that directly contradicted everything he has ever claimed to believe. Each one small on its own. Together, they are the most complete evidence the show has ever assembled for the argument that has been running since episode 1. That evidence deserves its own full examination. Section 5. 8 seasons of behavioral contradictions. The evidence the show has always been stacking. Here is a simple test. Take everything Rick Sanchez has ever said about himself and the universe and what he believes. Stack it up. All the speeches about meaninglessness, all the dismissals of love as just a chemical reaction, all the moments where he told Morty or Beth or whoever was nearby that nothing matters and caring is weakness, and the universe is a cold, indifferent machine that does not reward attachment. Stack all of that up on one side. Then, stack up everything Rick has ever done on the other side. The two piles do not match. They have never matched. Not in Season 1, not in the middle seasons, not now. The gap between what Rick says and what Rick does is not a character flaw or an inconsistency in the writing. It is the entire point. It is the show's central argument, running quietly underneath every adventure and every fart joke and every dimension-hopping catastrophe for 9 years. The argument is, watch what he does. Stop listening to what he says. Watch what he does. Season 8 made that argument more clearly than any season before it. Not through a single dramatic episode, but through a series of smaller moments spread across 10 episodes, each one individually easy to dismiss and collectively impossible to ignore. Together, they form the most complete picture the show has ever drawn of who Rick actually is. Not the character he performs, but the person underneath the performance. Start with Season 8, Episode 2, titled Valkyric. This is the first episode in the entire run of the show to focus exclusively on Rick and Space Beth. Just the two of them, no other main characters, working together on a mission. What happens in that episode is less important than what the episode reveals about Rick's relationship with his daughter. Rick and Space Beth are in the middle of a dangerous situation, and the show gives them time together that is not filtered through anyone else. Rick does not perform detachment for this version of Beth the same way he sometimes does with the family. He is more direct, more present. When something goes right, there is something in his reaction that the show has learned to catch, a flash of actual pride, not the exaggerated mock pride he uses as a joke, but the real kind. The episode also introduces a character named Cisco, and what Rick does with Cisco is philosophically significant in a way that goes beyond the plot. Rick trusts Cisco, completely and without reservation, which is not a thing Rick does. Ever. Space Beth points this out directly. She tells Rick that his entire plan depends on Cisco, and that having a plan with no backup, no contingency, no escape route, no paranoid second option, is completely out of character for him. Rick's response is that he trusts Cisco the same way he trusts Bird Person. Given that Bird Person is the person Rick considers his closest friend in the universe, that is an enormous statement. Rick is not performing trust here for an audience. He genuinely extended it. Cisco betrays him. The reasons are explained in a post-credit scene, and they are not personal. It is a complicated situation, not a simple act of malice. But the betrayal happens, and what matters philosophically is not the betrayal itself, but what came before it. Rick trusted someone, fully and without armor, and it cost him. And the Season 1 version of that story would have Rick saying something sarcastic about how, of course it cost him, of course trust is weakness, of course the universe operates exactly the way his nihilism predicts. Season 8 Rick does not do that. He absorbs the loss and keeps going. Then comes Episode 5, Cryomort a Rickver. Rick and Morty get themselves into a situation on a ship where a whole society of people is trying to survive after their home planet was destroyed. The adventure parts of the episode are genuinely funny. Rick has to disguise himself as an 11-year-old child belonging to a wealthy couple, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. But inside all of that, something small and real happens. Rick tells Morty something about his own childhood. He says he was lonely. He says he always wanted more love from his parents than he received, and that the reason he attached so strongly to the idea of having parents, even fake ones, in a disguise, on a ship, is because that desire never fully went away. Let that sit for a moment. Rick Sanchez, the man who has spent 9 seasons telling everyone around him that relationships are meaningless and that wanting things from other people is a form of stupidity, admits to his grandson that he spent his childhood desperately wanting to be loved by his parents and never quite getting enough of it. He does not frame this as weakness. He does not immediately wrap it in a joke and move on. He just says it. A real thing about himself, stated plainly, in the middle of an adventure that did not require him to say it. That is not the behavior of a nihilist. That is the behavior of a person who is slowly learning that the truth about themselves does not have to be a weapon they use against themselves. Episode 6, The Curixus Case of Benjamin Button, is the one that hits hardest in terms of raw emotional content. Both versions of Beth, the Beth who stayed and the space Beth who left, use technology to de-age themselves back to childhood. They become 10 years old again. They run around causing chaos, which is the comedic surface of the episode. Underneath that surface, what the episode is about is the childhood neither of them got to have fully. The years Rick was absent, the years that left gaps in both of them. At some point in the episode, the two Beths get the upper hand on Rick. They have him in a position where he cannot simply overpower the situation with intelligence or technology. He is stuck. And as he watches them, these two versions of his daughter, both 10 years old, both running and playing and being children in a way they were not always allowed to be, Rick cries. Not a single tear deployed for effect. Not the kind of emotional display Rick sometimes uses as a tool to manipulate a situation. He wells up with genuine tears of pride. The show holds on it. It does not cut away quickly or undercut it with a joke. Rick is proud of his daughters in a way that he cannot contain, in a moment where he has no audience to perform for and no reason to fake it. This is a man who told his daughter, in an early season, that he did not have a big relationship with her. A man who showed up after 20 years of absence and slotted back into the family garage like someone who had never been gone. Watching him cry with pride at two 10-year-old versions of his daughter is the show making its most direct statement yet about the distance Rick has traveled. Episode 7, Ricker Than Fiction, is worth mentioning for a different reason. Rick becomes frustrated with the movie franchise and uses a device to rewrite the script of an upcoming film. The device malfunctions and pulls Rick and Morty into the movie itself. What matters here philosophically is what Rick cares enough about to get frustrated with in the first place. He is not frustrated because the movie is dangerous or because it affects him directly. He is frustrated because he thinks it could have been better. He thinks the storytelling was lazy and the characters were not handled with enough care. Rick, the man who insists nothing matters, is deeply annoyed on behalf of fictional characters who deserved better writing. You cannot be annoyed on behalf of fictional characters if you genuinely believe nothing matters. Annoyance on behalf of someone else requires caring. Rick cares. He has always cared. The show just keeps finding new, small ways to demonstrate it. Then there is the Bug-Ann situation.
which runs quietly through the season's background.
Rick is in a casual relationship with Bug-Ann. Casual on his terms, meaning he has specifically told her not to get too close, meaning he has set the distance the same way he sets all distances. And then, across the season, that distance starts to shift. He agrees to go to a family event with her. He thinks about her when she is not around. He sends her a text in the finale. Just, hey. 2 letters. Nothing that could be called a declaration. Nothing that could be called vulnerable. Just the smallest possible reaching out from a man who has spent 40 years making sure nobody could reach back. She does not respond. But the fact that he sent it is the whole point. Now step back and look at all of this together. 1 season, 10 episodes. Rick trusting someone completely and getting burned. Rick admitting childhood loneliness to his grandson. Rick crying with pride at his daughters. Rick getting annoyed on behalf of fictional characters because he thought they deserved better. Rick sending a 2-letter text to a woman he was trying to let get closer. Stack that against the speeches about meaninglessness, the declarations that love is just a chemical reaction, the dismissals of emotional connection as weakness, the nihilism. They do not match. They have never matched. And Season 8 makes this mismatch more visible than any season before it because Rick is no longer even really trying to maintain the gap between the two. He is not performing nihilism as aggressively as he used to. The performance has worn thin. The armor has gaps in it. The man underneath is showing through in more places than he used to. This is the accumulation the show has been building since episode 1. Not in a straight line, the show is too smart for that, and Rick's growth is not linear, which is one of the things that makes it feel real. He takes steps forward and then behaves terribly in the next episode. He opens up and then shuts down again 2 scenes later. Growth in Rick and Morty looks the way growth looks in real life, which is messy and inconsistent and sometimes barely visible at all. But the direction has been clear for several seasons now, and Season 8 made it undeniable. There is a line from one of the producers of the show, a simple statement made in a behind-the-scenes discussion about Season 8, that captures this exactly. They said that looking back at where the show started, the characters have really evolved over the past 8 seasons. When the series began, it was more about Rick constantly causing chaos and being blamed by the family for all of their problems. In Season 8, Rick is starting to become much more of a family man, exploring a new relationship, and building a healthier connection with his daughters and grandchildren. That is not a fan's interpretation. That is the people who made the show describing what they deliberately built. The behavioral contradictions were not accidents. The moments where Rick's actions disprove his words were not continuity errors. The show was always stacking evidence. Season by season, episode by episode, small moment by small moment, building a case. The case is not complicated. It is actually very simple. Rick Sanchez is not a nihilist who occasionally slips up and shows humanity. He is a deeply feeling person who built a nihilist performance as a survival tool, and that performance has been slowly losing its hold on him for 9 seasons. Season 8 is the season where the performance became genuinely difficult to maintain. Not because Rick decided to stop pretending. He did not make a conscious decision to let his walls down. They came down because life kept happening, and life kept requiring him to respond to it as a person rather than as a philosophy. Season 9 starts with all of that evidence already in place. The viewers have seen it. The characters around Rick have seen it, even if they do not always have the language to name it. And Rick himself, on some level, has seen it. Because you cannot cry at your daughters and admit childhood loneliness and send a 2-letter text to someone you care about without knowing, even if you will not say it out loud, that the story you have been telling about yourself is not the whole truth. The behavioral contradictions are not going away in Season 9. Martyr said Rick still has plenty of mean left in him, and that is accurate. But the mean in Season 9 is operating in a different context than the mean in Season 1. In Season 1, the mean was backed up by a complete philosophical framework that said the universe was indifferent and caring was weakness. In Season 9, the mean is a habit running on its own momentum without the framework it was built inside. That is a very different thing, and it is the thing Season 9 has to confront head-on. underscore underscore quote underscore for underscore underscore. All of that evidence, all 8 seasons of Rick doing the opposite of what he says, points toward a single question the show has been circling for years without fully landing on. And the question is not really about what Rick does. It is about why he keeps choosing the specific cover story he chooses. Because nihilism is not the only way a person can protect themselves from caring too much. There are other options. Rick did not accidentally land on nihilism. He chose it, or something like it chose him. And the reason for that choice, the actual philosophical identity underneath the armor, is something most people who watch and analyze this show have gotten completely wrong, including most of the fans, including most of the videos made about it. Section 6. The Bug-Ann Problem. What happens when Rick tries to want something? There is a specific kind of courage that does not look like courage at all. It does not involve weapons or portals or outsmarting an enemy in the last 10 seconds of a fight. It does not come with music or a slow-motion shot or any of the signals that television usually uses to tell the audience something important is happening. It looks, from the outside, like almost nothing. Like a man standing in his garage holding his phone, having typed 2 letters, deciding whether or not to press send. That is the most courageous thing Rick Sanchez does in all of Season 8. The Bug-Ann storyline does not get the attention it deserves because it is not loud. It does not have explosions attached to it. It is not the episode where Rick cries or the episode where he admits something heavy about his childhood. It is quieter than all of those things. And quiet things in Rick and Morty tend to get overlooked because the show surrounds them with so much noise. But the Bug-Ann situation is philosophically the most important thread in Season 8, because it is the first time in the entire run of the show that Rick attempts to want something for himself that is not revenge, not adventure, and not a project he can complete with his intelligence alone. Bug-Ann is introduced as someone Rick is involved with casually. That word, casually, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because for Rick, casual is not just a preference, it is a requirement. Casual means no expectations. Casual means no vulnerability. Casual means the distance is built into the arrangement from the beginning so that nobody has to be honest about what they actually want. Rick is very good at casual. He has had a lot of practice at it. Casual is armor wearing a relaxed expression. What makes Bug-Ann different from the beginning is that she is not willing to stay inside the casual arrangement without naming it. She knows Rick has not moved on from Diane. She tells him directly. She is aware that whatever space exists between them is partially occupied by a 40-year-old grief that Rick has never fully processed, and she names that clearly instead of pretending it is not there. She does not do this to pressure him or give him an ultimatum. She does it because she is honest. And honesty is something Rick is almost never on the receiving end of in a way that is gentle rather than combative. Rick's response to her honesty is to do the thing Rick always does when something real gets too close. He creates distance. He tells her that she does not want to get any closer than they already are. He frames this as a kindness to her, as though he is protecting her from something, as though the distance is for her benefit rather than his own. This is one of Rick's most consistent patterns across the whole show. When he is protecting himself, he presents it as protecting someone else. The armor disguises itself as consideration. But something is different in Season 8. Something in Rick is not entirely convinced by his own argument anymore. The walls have been coming down, slowly, across several seasons, and the usual moves do not land with quite the same authority they used to. The performance has worn thin. And so instead of simply maintaining the distance and moving on, Rick does something unexpected. He starts trying. He agrees to go to a family event with Bug-Ann. This sounds small. In the context of who Rick is, it is enormous. A family event means meeting people. It means being introduced as someone she brought. It means existing in a social context as a person in a relationship, rather than as a lone genius who passes through other people's lives without leaving a mark. It means being seen in a specific way, attached to a specific person, present and accountable.
Every single one of those things is something Rick has spent 9 seasons avoiding. He agrees to go anyway. The show does not make a big deal of this. It does not pause and underline it. It just happens, as part of the fabric of the season. Another small crack in the wall running alongside the bigger events of the finale. But it is worth pausing on, because the willingness to show up to something ordinary, to sit in a room with people you do not know and be someone's person, is exactly the kind of thing that Rick's philosophy has always declared beneath him. Ordinary connection, everyday presence, the things that Memory Rick was doing inside Jerry's memories, the things that Slow Mobius's widow found at a bar after her own loss. Rick is edging toward those things in real life for the first time. Then, the finale happens.
Memory Rick takes over Beth's mind. The family goes through a crisis. Everything gets loud and complicated and dangerous the way things in Rick and Morty always eventually do. Rick saves his daughter. He makes the choice to let Memory Rick and Memory Diane live in the ant farm at the edge of space rather than deleting them. He removes the memory of Diane from his own mind deliberately so that he can, as the show puts it, be more emotionally open. So that the space Diane occupied, which had been held by grief for 40 years, can potentially be filled by something living rather than something lost. And then, in the closing moments of the season, he picks up his phone and he types "Hey" to Bug Ann. She leaves it on read. The show ends there, with that unanswered text, and it is one of the most painfully honest endings the series has ever produced, because the text is not the sad part. The sad part is what the text represents. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, the man who has traveled across every dimension, who has defeated every enemy and survived every catastrophe and outlasted every system that ever tried to contain him, sent someone a 2-letter word and waited. Vulnerable in the smallest, most ordinary way possible. Not saving the world, not outsmarting anything, just waiting to see if someone he cared about would write back. She did not. Now think about what this means for Season 9. The Bug Ann situation leaves Rick in a position the show has never put him in before. He has not been rejected in any meaningful way since Diane. The relationships Rick has had since losing Diane have all been structured to avoid this exact feeling. Unity, the hive mind he was involved with in Season 2, ended that relationship, not the other way around. Rick did not put himself in a position to be rejected by Unity because he kept the relationship defined on terms that gave him an exit. Every connection Rick has had since Diane has had an exit built in, a reason it was not real, a layer of distance that meant the loss of it would not feel the same as a real loss. The text to Bug Ann did not have an exit built in. He sent it after removing Diane from his memory, which means he sent it without the usual buffer of grief to retreat into. He sent it as close to openly as Rick is capable of being, and the response was nothing. This is the Bug Ann problem. Not that she did not respond. Her reasons may be entirely understandable, and the show may address them in Season 9. The problem is what her silence does to the specific experiment Rick was running. The experiment was, what happens if I try? What happens if I take a small step toward the kind of ordinary human connection I have spent 9 seasons telling myself I do not need or want? What does the universe do with that? The universe left it on red. A Season 1 Rick would take this as confirmation. Of course, the universe is indifferent. Connection is a weakness. The nihilism was right all along. Put the armor back on, pour a drink, and stop pretending there was ever any point in trying. The evidence supports the original conclusion. Case closed. But Season 1 Rick and Season 9 Rick are not the same person. Season 9 Rick has already cried at his daughters, has already admitted he was lonely as a child, has already given his better self a happy ending and walked away. The armor does not fit the same way it used to. The nihilism does not have the same foundation it was built on. He cannot simply reach for the old conclusion because the structure that held the old conclusion up has been dismantled, piece by piece, over 8 seasons. So what does a man like Rick do when the experiment fails, but the old answer is no longer available?
That is the question Season 9 inherits from the Bug-Ann problem. Not whether Rick will try again, though that is interesting. Not whether Bug-Ann will respond, though that matters too. The deeper question is whether Rick has developed enough of a new way of seeing himself to survive ordinary disappointment without using it as proof of the old philosophy. Because ordinary disappointment is the hardest thing for Rick. The catastrophic stuff, enemies, near-death situations, dimension-destroying events, those Rick handles. He has built himself for catastrophe. Catastrophe is loud and fast and requires intelligence to navigate. And intelligence is the thing Rick has always had in abundance. Ordinary disappointment is different. It is quiet. It does not require intelligence. It just sits there and asks you to feel it without doing anything about it. Rick has never been good at that. Every time something ordinary has hurt him, he has immediately converted it into something he could act on. A mission, a project, a target. The text with no response does not give him anything to act on. There is no enemy to hunt, no dimension to escape into, no version of the problem that can be solved with a portal gun. Just the silence on the other side of a two-letter word, and a man trying to figure out what to do with it. Showrunner Scott Martyr said that Rick still has plenty of mean left in him heading into Season 9, and also that the episode ideas are still really flowing. Both of those things are true, and both point in the same direction. The mean is still there. The creative chaos is still there. Rick is not going to become a gentle, soft-spoken person who processes his feelings in an orderly way. That is not who he is, and it is not who he will ever be. But the mean and the chaos are now operating in a context where the usual philosophical cover for them has been removed. The nihilism was the explanation. Without it, the mean is just mean. And mean without an explanation is something Rick is going to have to look at differently. The Bug-Ann problem is not really about Bug-Ann. It is about what Rick discovers when the smallest possible act of openness, hey, 2 letters, just trying, meets the universe's most ordinary kind of indifference. Not cosmic cruelty. Not Rick Prime with a weapon designed to erase everything he loves. Just a phone screen with no notification. Just quiet.
Season 9 Rick has to live in that quiet. Without Diane to grieve, without Rick Prime to hunt, without Memory Rick to carry the feelings he could not, without the nihilism as a shelter. Just a man, a garage, a phone, and the slow, uncomfortable work of figuring out what wanting something actually feels like when you have spent 40 years pretending you did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Bug-Ann situation, and all the cracks it represents in Rick's armor, only makes sense in the context of a bigger misunderstanding that has followed this show since the beginning. Because what most people call Rick's philosophy is not actually what Rick's philosophy is. The label that got attached to him in Season 1 stuck, and it was always slightly wrong, and getting it wrong has caused almost everyone, fans, critics, video essayists, the internet at large, to misread what the show has actually been doing with his character for 9 years. The correction to that misreading is the key to understanding why Season 9 is philosophically different from every season before it. Section 7. The Cynic versus the Nihilist. Rick's philosophy was always misdiagnosed. Everyone called Rick a nihilist. The internet called him a nihilist. Academic papers called him a nihilist. The show itself sometimes used the word. And it is easy to see why the label stuck. Rick drinks heavily, declares that nothing matters, travels between dimensions so fast that individual lives blur into insignificance, and spends most of his time behaving as though the rules everyone else lives by are beneath him. That is a pretty convincing nihilist impression. But impressions are not the same as the real thing. And the gap between what Rick performs and what Rick actually is has always been the most important gap in the show. The nihilist label is another version of the same mistake. Listening to what Rick says instead of watching what he does. Nihilism, at its most basic, is the belief that nothing has meaning. Not just that life is hard, or that the universe is indifferent, or that individual people are small in the grand scheme of things. Those are observations about reality. Nihilism goes further. It says that there is no such thing as right or wrong.
no value in anything, no reason to prefer one outcome over another. A true nihilist does not get angry, does not have preferences, does not push back against anything, because pushing back requires caring about the difference between how things are and how they should be. A true nihilist just drifts, wherever the universe blows them. Rick does not drift. Rick has never drifted. Rick pushes back against things constantly and with enormous energy and very specific targets. He does not push back against everything equally. He pushes back against specific things. Stupidity, pretense, authority that has not earned its authority, systems that exist to control people rather than to serve them, leaders who got their position through tradition or politics rather than actual ability, rules that exist because someone powerful decided to make them, not because they make any rational sense, people who perform confidence they have not earned.
That is not nihilism. That is something much older and much more specific. It is the philosophy of the Cynics, a group of ancient Greek thinkers whose most famous member was a man named Diogenes. The Cynics believed that society was built on a foundation of pretense, and that most of what people called civilization was actually just an elaborate system for avoiding honesty. They rejected wealth, reputation, and social status. They lived in ways that deliberately broke the rules everyone else followed, specifically to expose how arbitrary those rules were. They were not against meaning, they were against fake meaning. They were not against values, they were against values that nobody had actually examined but everyone pretended were obvious. Diogenes, their most famous practitioner, was known for carrying a lamp through the streets in broad daylight, saying he was looking for an honest man. He lived in a large clay jar. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful person on earth at that moment, came to visit him and asked if there was anything Diogenes wanted, Diogenes told him to get out of his sunlight. Not because he thought Alexander was meaningless, because he thought Alexander's power was not a good enough reason to give him special treatment. Rick Sanchez carries a portal gun through the multiverse, saying there is nothing worth believing in. He lives in a garage. When the President of the United States, frequently portrayed in the show as someone Rick has a running, complicated rivalry with, tries to use his authority to control Rick, Rick refuses completely and repeatedly. Not because Rick thinks the president is meaningless, because he thinks the authority is not a good enough reason to comply. The parallel is not an accident. Rick was built around this specific philosophical tradition, even if the show never names it directly. The giveaway is what Rick actually gets angry about. He does not get angry randomly. He gets angry at specific things, at people who pretend to be something they are not, at systems that exist to benefit the people running them at the expense of everyone else, at laziness disguised as tradition, at cruelty that calls itself logic. These are precisely the things a Cynic philosopher would target. Not because nothing matters, but because pretending that false things matter is a specific kind of dishonesty that the Cynic philosophy treats as the worst offense. Think about the Galactic Federation. Rick did not dismantle the Galactic Federation because he was bored, or because chaos is funny, or because nothing matters, so why not? He dismantled it because it was a system of control that existed to benefit the people at the top of it. He went to extraordinary lengths, getting himself captured, going to prison, engineering a specific set of events from inside a detention center to tear the whole thing down. That is not the behavior of someone who believes nothing matters. That is the behavior of someone with a very clear idea of what is wrong and a very strong commitment to doing something about it. The same logic applies to the Citadel, the organization built around infinite versions of Rick and Morty from across the multiverse. The Citadel was a system that had developed its own hierarchy, its own politics, its own ways of keeping certain Ricks and Mortys at the top and certain ones at the bottom. Rick's relationship with it was always hostile, not because he believed the lives inside it were meaningless, but because the structure of it was built on the exact kind of arbitrary authority he has always found intolerable. Rick does not blow up systems because nothing matters. Rick blows up systems because those systems are built on pretense, and pretense is the one thing his philosophy cannot tolerate. Now here is why this distinction matters enormously for Season 9. A nihilist with no mission is finished. If nothing matters and the thing you were doing is gone,
there is nothing left. The philosophy offers no forward motion once the immediate action runs out. This is what Evil Morty predicted would happen to Rick after Rick Prime died. He assumed that without the mission, Rick would fall apart, because he was reading Rick as a nihilist, and a nihilist without a purpose has nothing. But a cynic with no mission is not finished. A cynic's project is not tied to a single target. The cynic's project is permanent because pretense is permanent. There will always be another system built on dishonesty. There will always be another authority that has not earned its authority.
There will always be another version of the thing the cynic is against. The performance of meaning rather than actual meaning. The costume of value rather than real value. The cynic never runs out of work, because the thing the cynic is fighting is a permanent feature of how people and systems organize themselves. Rick still has plenty of mean left in him. That is what Martyr said, and he is right. But understanding why that mean is still there, and why it does not simply collapse along with the nihilism, requires understanding that the mean was never really nihilism in the first place. The mean is cynicism. It is the refusal to pretend. It is the hound-like commitment to sniffing out dishonesty and refusing to give it the respect it is asking for. Season 9 inherits a Rick whose grief is gone and whose primary mission is complete. Those were the nihilist elements, the grief organized into meaninglessness, the mission organized into a reason to keep existing. Both of those are finished. What remains after them is not nothing. What remains is the cynic underneath. The part of Rick that was there before Diane died and before the hunt began. The part that always found authority ridiculous and pretense intolerable, and the gap between what people say and what they do absolutely worthy of attention. That part is not damaged. It has not been dismantled by 8 seasons of growth and loss. If anything, it is cleaner now, freed from the wreckage of the grief and the mission that were piled on top of it. Season 9 Rick is, in some ways, closer to the philosophical core of what Rick actually is than any previous version has been, because all the survival tools built on top of that core have been stripped away, one by one. Here is the complication. The cynic's philosophy is very good for certain things and very bad for others. It is very good for identifying what is false. It is very bad for building something true. Diogenes could tell you everything that was wrong with Alexander the Great's empire, but Diogenes was also living in a jar and dying alone. The cynic's gift is critique. The cynic's weakness is that critique alone does not make a life. Rick has spent 9 seasons being extraordinarily good at identifying what is false. False systems, false authority, false comfort, false meaning. He can see through pretense from across a dimension. What he has always been terrible at is building something true to replace what he has torn down. Every relationship he has tried to maintain has been structured to limit his exposure to its realness. Every connection he has allowed has had a distance built into it. Season 9 is the first season where the cynic has to confront his own limitation directly. Not an enemy he can outsmart. Not a system he can dismantle. The limitation is internal. It is the gap between being able to see clearly and being willing to act on what you see. Rick knows what is true. He has always known. He knows that the people around him matter to him. He knows that the connections he has been avoiding are the same ones he has been desperate for since childhood. He knows that the armor is a choice rather than a necessity. Knowing something and being able to live inside that knowledge are 2 completely different skills. Rick has the first one completely. He has been slowly, painfully developing the second one across 8 seasons. Season 9 is where those 2 things have to find a way to exist together in the same person. The cynic in Rick is intact. The mean is real and it has not gone anywhere. But for the first time, the cynic is not hiding behind a nihilist mask. The mean no longer has the same cover it used to. When Rick pushes back in Season 9, and he will push back against everything because that is who he fundamentally is, he is doing it without the philosophical shelter that said none of it mattered anyway. That is an exposed position for a man who has spent 40 years making sure he was never exposed. The misdiagnosis of Rick as a nihilist was always a comfortable reading because it let both the character and the audience off the hook. If nothing matters, then Rick's cruelty is logical, his detachment is rational, and his refusal to build anything lasting is philosophically justified. The Cynic reading removes that comfort. If Rick's philosophy is actually about the commitment to honesty and the refusal of pretense, then his cruelty is not logical, it is habitual. His detachment is not rational, it is protective. And his refusal to build anything lasting is not a philosophical position, it is a fear. And Season 9 is where that fear has nowhere left to hide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But philosophy, however accurately diagnosed, only explains so much. The actual test of Season 9 is not what Rick believes in theory, it is what the season itself shows us in practice. And there are specific confirmed details about Season 9, real things we already know from footage and creator statements, that point directly toward how the show intends to explore this new version of Rick. The evidence is already there, hiding in plain sight, in a sneak peek that most people watched as a comedy clip without noticing what it was actually showing. Section 8. What the Season 9 sneak peek already tells us. Most people watched the Season 9 sneak peek and laughed at the carrot joke. That is the correct response. The carrot joke is funny. Principal Vagina, a character the show has used since the very first season as a recurring joke about a man with an unfortunate name who takes himself extremely seriously, calls Beth and Jerry into his office to report that Morty and Summer have been behaving terribly. He lists their offenses with the gravity of someone announcing a national emergency. Morty and Summer, sitting in the chairs across from him, show absolutely no remorse and no respect for the authority he is trying to project. When Beth tries to intervene, Summer uses some kind of device to mute what the sneak peek calls the boomer frequency, essentially filtering out the voices of everyone in the room who is over a certain age trying to tell them what to do. Then Rick walks in. He is wearing farming gear. He is carrying a hoe, a garden tool, the kind used for turning over soil. He uses it to turn Principal Vagina into a carrot. Vagina, now a carrot, is horrified. He immediately agrees to unexpel Morty and Summer and promises them all good grades. Rick has solved the problem. Beth then turns on Rick and tells him that he has turned Morty and Summer into spoiled people who cannot face any consequences because Rick always swoops in and removes the consequences before they land. The scene ends. Rick decides that Morty and Summer need to be sent to a camp that handles exactly this kind of problem. Kids who have been protected from difficulty for so long that they no longer know how to handle it. Everyone moved on and talked about the carrot. But look at the scene again. Not at what happens in it, at what it reveals about where Rick is when Season 9 begins. Rick shows up to his grandchildren's school, in farming gear, with a garden tool. This means that whatever Rick was doing before this moment, the thing he was in the middle of when this situation came to his attention, was farming. Rick Sanchez, the man who has traveled across every dimension in the known multiverse, who has dismantled galactic governments and built weapons that could erase people from existence, was apparently doing something as quiet and grounded and ordinary as tending to a garden when he got the call about his grandkids. This is not a throwaway detail. The show is extremely deliberate about the images it chooses, especially in the moments that kick off a new season. The first image of Rick in Season 9 confirmed footage is a man in a garden. Not a laboratory, not a spaceship, not a dimension-hopping adventure in progress. A garden. Something that requires patience. Something that grows slowly. Something that cannot be rushed by intelligence or fixed by a portal gun. You cannot outsmart a plant into growing faster. You just have to show up for it consistently and wait. Rick in a Garden is the show saying something about where Rick is emotionally at the start of Season 9. He is doing something quiet, something present, something that belongs to ordinary life rather than extraordinary life. Whatever happened at the end of Season 8, the memory removal, the ant farm at the edge of space, the unanswered text, Rick did not respond by immediately launching himself into chaos. He responded by doing something with his hands in the dirt. Now look at what he does when he arrives at the school. He does not negotiate. He does not give a speech. He does not try to reason with Principal Vagina or work within the system or find a clever solution that respects the authority structure of the situation. He turns the authority figure into a vegetable with a garden tool he happened to be carrying. Clean, immediate, no patience for the performance of authority that has not earned any actual respect. The Cynic is completely intact. The mean martyr promised is right there in the first confirmed scene of the season. Rick has not softened into someone who works within systems or respects rules he finds ridiculous. The part of him that finds pretense intolerable is operating at full power. Principal Vagina was performing authority, using his position to make himself feel important rather than to actually help the children in his care. And Rick removed him from that performance immediately and without apology. But then something else happens that is equally important and much easier to miss. After turning Vagina into a carrot and solving the immediate problem, Rick does not declare victory and leave. He stays. He engages with what Beth says to him. He listens to her point, that he has been protecting Morty and Summer from consequences so thoroughly that they have lost the ability to handle difficulty, and he takes it seriously enough to form a response. His response is to send them to a camp designed to address exactly that problem. Rick is parenting. Badly, in his specific way, using methods that no normal parent would use, but he is parenting. He heard Beth's concern, processed it, and acted on it. That is not the behavior of a man who believes his family is meaningless. That is the behavior of a man who is engaged with his family's well-being in a hands-on, present, involved way, even if his version of involvement involves converting school administrators into root vegetables. The sneak peek also confirms something important about Morty and Summer's current state. They are described in the footage as having zero respect for authority, muting the adults around them, and sitting in the principal's office with the relaxed confidence of people who have never faced a consequence that actually stuck. Beth blames Rick for this directly. She says he has made them into spoiled people by always intervening before anything difficult can reach them. This is a fascinating accusation because it is both a criticism of Rick and, from a different angle, evidence of how much Rick has been showing up. You cannot make your grandchildren spoiled by being too present unless you have actually been present. The version of Rick from Season 1, the one who showed up after 20 years and barely acknowledged the family existed, could not have produced the problem Beth is describing. The problem Beth is describing requires a Rick who has been consistently, reliably there, intervening, protecting, showing up. He has been showing up so consistently and so reliably that his grandchildren have adjusted their behavior around the certainty of his presence. That is not a small thing. For Rick Sanchez, after 40 years of running, being so consistently present that it has changed the people around him is one of the most significant developments in the entire show. Now step back and look at everything the sneak peek contains in about 90 seconds of footage. Rick in farming gear, doing something ordinary. Rick arriving at a school, a deeply domestic everyday location, as an involved grandparent. Rick using his abilities to solve a family problem rather than a cosmic one. Rick listening to Beth and taking her concerns seriously enough to act on it. Rick being so reliably present that his grandchildren have become dependent on his interventions. And underneath all of that, completely unchanged, Rick turning an authority figure into a carrot without blinking. Rick having no patience for pretense. Rick solving problems in ways that are entirely his own, regardless of what the situation is supposed to require. Both things are true at once. The Cynic is still there, full strength, completely unapologetic. And the family man is also there, more present, more engaged, more woven into the daily life of the people he loves than he has ever been before. Adult Swim president Michael Uwelin, in his statement about Season 9, said that from the very first frame, viewers are going to see great high-concept insanity alongside some of the best character writing the show has ever done. Those two things existing together, the insanity and the character depth, is exactly what the sneak peek demonstrates in miniature. It is funny and it is revealing at the same time. The carrot is funny, the farming gear is revealing. Showrunner Scott Marder also confirmed that Season 9 continues to push at the idea of false reality in a genuinely new way. The specifics of that are still unknown. The season has not aired yet as of this writing, but the pattern is clear from everything the show has built. Every time Rick has engaged with false reality, it has been connected to his own psychology, the fabricated memories, the simulations, the ant farm at the edge of space, where a memory of his better self lives with a memory of the woman he loved. The show uses false reality as a mirror for whatever Rick is refusing to look at directly in real reality. A Season 9 episode that deals with false reality in a totally new way arrives at a moment when Rick has just stripped away the last layers of his own constructed false reality, the grief and the mission and the nihilist performance. Whatever the false reality episode in Season 9 is about, it is happening to a Rick who has fewer walls than he has ever had before. That makes the mirror more dangerous. There is less armor between Rick and what it reflects. The sneak peek and the confirmed details about Season 9 are pointing in the same direction from multiple angles. The Cynic is intact. The family man is more present than ever. The false reality work continues. The character writing is, by the creator's own account, some of the best the show has produced. And all of that sits on top of a version of Rick who arrived at Season 9 having completed the long, painful work of dismantling everything he built to survive his grief. A man in farming gear with a garden tool and a lot of mean left in him, showing up to his grandkids' school on a Tuesday morning. That image is Season 9 in a single frame. __7_Rick arriving in farming gear at a school in Season 9 is funny on its surface and honest underneath it. But there is a confirmed detail about the season that goes deeper than any single scene. During a direct conversation with fans, the showrunners mentioned something specific about Season 9 and false reality, that the season contains an episode dealing with that theme in a completely new way. What they did not say, but what the show has been building toward across every season, is why that particular theme keeps coming back. The reason it keeps coming back is the same reason Rick keeps building walls. And the episode that finally deals with it differently is arriving at exactly the moment when the man who usually builds the walls has just torn the last one down himself. Section 9. The False Reality Thread. Season 9's confirmed experiment. Rick and Morty has a recurring obsession, and it is not the one most people name. Most people say the show is obsessed with nihilism, or with family dysfunction, or with the comedy of a genius dragging an anxious teenager through situations that should not exist. Those readings are all accurate as far as they go, but underneath all of them, running through the show like a wire through a wall, is a different obsession. One that shows up in more episodes than any other single idea. One that the show returns to season after season with slightly different packaging, but always the same underlying question.
The obsession is with false reality, with constructed versions of the world that feel real, but are not. With the question of what happens to a person when the reality they have been living inside turns out to be something that was built rather than something that simply is. The show has explored this idea more times and in more ways than almost any other animated series in history, and every single time it comes back to this theme, the episode is ultimately about Rick. Not always on the surface. Sometimes the episode looks like it is about Morty, or about the family, or about some alien civilization the characters stumble across. But underneath, the false reality episodes are always asking the same question about the same person. The question is, what is Rick hiding from? And how elaborate does the thing he is hiding inside have to be before he notices it is a cage? The history of this theme in the show is worth tracing carefully because it is the context that makes the Season 9 confirmation so significant. In the very early seasons, false reality shows up as a concept the show plays with lightly. There are simulations, there are alternate timelines, there are moments where the audience is not sure which version of events is the real one. These are mostly used for comedy and for the general sense of instability that the show is built around. Nothing is solid, nothing is certain. The multiverse means that any given reality is just one of an infinite number of possible realities, which means the word real becomes slippery the moment you start pulling at it. But then the show starts using false reality in a more specific and personal way. It starts pointing the idea directly at Rick. The most important early example is the fabricated memory Rick constructs in the Season 3 premiere, titled The Rickshank Rickdemption. Rick, while being held and interrogated, appears to give his captors access to his most important memory, the memory of how he built his first portal gun. The interrogators believe they are seeing the real origin of Rick's technology. They are watching what they think is genuine footage from inside Rick's actual past. What they are actually watching is a story Rick invented on the spot, designed specifically to manipulate them into giving him exactly what he needed to escape. The fake memory is perfect. It looks completely real. It has emotional weight to it, a version of Rick receiving the plans for a portal gun from a mysterious visitor, with young Beth and Diane present, with the weight of tragedy built into the ending. It is constructed to be believable because Rick understands exactly what people expect a meaningful memory to look like, and he built one to those specifications. The interesting thing is not that Rick fooled his captors with a fake memory. The interesting thing is how good he was at building it, how natural it felt, how easily he constructed a version of his past that looked exactly like the kind of formative, emotionally significant moment that should explain who he is. Rick is extraordinarily skilled at building realities that look genuine because he has had a lot of practice. Some of that practice has been with other people. Some of it has been with himself. Then there is the Season 5 episode titled Amortican Grick-Fitty, which involves a simulation Rick accidentally leaves Morty and Summer trapped inside. But the more relevant Season 8 example is the one that sits quietly in the background of the whole season without being named directly as a false reality episode. Rick has spent years with a version of Diane living inside his own memory. Not the real Diane, who was erased by the Omega device, but a constructed version of her. A memory that had become so detailed and so lived in that it had effectively become its own reality. Memory Rick treated that constructed Diane as fully real, fully present, fully worth fighting for. The line between the real person and the preserved memory had dissolved completely. That is a false reality, not a simulation with visible walls.
Not a fabricated memory constructed for someone else's benefit. A false reality Rick built inside himself, brick by brick, over 40 years. Because the real reality, the one where Diane was gone and never coming back, was one he could not fully live inside. By removing Diane from his memory at the end of Season 8, Rick dismantled his most personal false reality. The one he had been maintaining the longest. The one that had structured everything else. When that came down, Rick was left standing in actual reality. No constructed grief to organize his days, no preserved version of the past to retreat into, no mission built around protecting a memory of what used to be. Just the present moment. Just Tuesday. Just a garage and a family and a phone with an unanswered text on it. This is the state Rick is in when Season 9 begins. And this is why the confirmed detail from showrunner Scott Marder, that Season 9 contains an episode dealing with false reality in a completely new way, is so significant. Marder said it clearly and directly during the Reddit conversation with fans. Season 9 has a really cool episode that deals with false reality in a totally different way than the show has done before. He did not give specifics beyond that. The episode titles that have been confirmed for Season 9 do not immediately point to which one it is. The confirmed titles include Erickerhead, Jarebud, Mort Gully The Last Rick Forest, Rick Days 7 Nights, Rick Foo Hustle, Salute Your Morts, Sericnity 2019, and There's Something About Morty. Any one of these could be the false reality episode, and without having seen the season, it is impossible to know which. What is possible to know is what the false reality theme means when it arrives in Season 9 specifically. Because the version of Rick who encounters this episode is different from every previous version who has encountered the theme. Previous false reality episodes arrived while Rick still had his internal false reality fully intact. He was the man with the constructed grief and the preserved memory and the armor built around all of it. When the show pointed the false reality mirror at him in earlier seasons, he was looking at it through his own constructed world. The reflection was always distorted by everything he was already carrying. Season 9 Rick has put down the constructed world. He dismantled it himself. The false reality he maintained internally for 40 years is gone, which means when the show points the false reality mirror at him this time, there is almost nothing between Rick and what the mirror reflects. No buffer, no protection, no layer of constructed meaning to soften what he sees. That is a completely different kind of confrontation with the theme. Not Rick encountering a false reality from inside his own false reality. Rick encountering a false reality while standing in actual reality for possibly the first time in his adult life. The show has also established a clear pattern with its false reality episodes that is worth noting. In almost every case, the false reality in question is providing something the person trapped inside it genuinely needs and cannot get from actual reality. The simulation is not usually just a trap or a trick. It is a wish. It is the shape of something missing made into a place a person can live inside. Rick's internal false reality, the preserved version of Diane, the grief organized into a mission, was providing exactly that. It was providing structure, purpose, a reason to keep going that felt personal and urgent and worth the cost. Real reality, without those things, is harder to live inside. Not because real reality is worse than the false one, because real reality requires a different set of skills than the false one did. It requires presence instead of purpose, patience instead of pursuit, the willingness to build something new instead of maintaining something old. A Season 9 false reality episode that approaches this theme in a completely new way is most likely doing something the show has never done before with it. Not using false reality as a trap Rick has to escape, or a trick someone is playing on him, or a simulation he stumbles into accidentally. More likely doing something that asks whether Rick, stripped of his internal false reality, might be tempted to build a new one, and whether the thing that would tempt him most is not an enemy, or a mission, or a cosmic threat, just the ordinary warmth of a version of the world where things worked out differently. Season 9 is the first season where Rick does not have a pre-existing constructed world to fall back into when reality gets difficult. The false reality episode is arriving at exactly the moment when the man most skilled at building false realities is also the most exposed he has ever been. Martyr described it as really cool. That is probably an understatement. The pattern across the entire show points toward an episode that is not primarily about the adventure or the concept or the comedy of the false reality premise. It is about what Rick chooses when the false reality offers him something actual reality currently cannot. After the grief is gone and the mission is dead and the text went unanswered, what constructed world would be most tempting to a man who knows exactly how to build one? That question is the philosophical heart of the false reality thread in Season 9. And whatever the episode turns out to be, it is landing on a version of Rick who has never been less protected from its implications. __quote_8___. The false reality thread is one of the most interesting confirmed details about Season 9. But there is a bigger picture that contains all of these details. The Bug-Ann situation, the farming gear, the false reality episode, the intact Cynic, the dismantled grief. And that bigger picture was described by the people who made the show in language that is worth examining very carefully. Because what the producers said about where Rick is heading, and what they said about the distance he has already traveled, points towards something the show has been building towards since the pilot. Something that Season 9 is going to have to confront directly. Something that has a name. Section 10. Steve Levy's promise. He has come a very long way from the pilot. 6 words. That is all it took. During a direct conversation with fans in September 2025, executive producer Steve Levy was asked about Rick's future on the show. His answer was not long. He did not lay out a detailed roadmap or describe specific episodes or make promises about dramatic moments coming up. He just said that he was excited about where the show was taking Rick over the next few seasons. And then he added 6 words that contain more information about the direction of the show than most paragraph-length statements would. He said, "He has come a very long way from the pilot."
That sentence is doing a lot of work. Not because it is dramatic, it is actually one of the least dramatic things a person could say about a television character, but because of what it implies. Coming a very long way means the journey has been real and the distance has been measurable. It means the person who started the story and the person currently living inside it are not the same person in any simple sense. And it means that the people making the show are aware of this, are tracking it deliberately, and are excited about where the remaining distance leads. To understand why Levy's statement matters, you have to go back to the pilot and look at it honestly. Pilot Rick is, by any reasonable measure, a disaster. He shows up drunk in the middle of the night, drags his 14-year-old grandson out of bed, takes him on an unsanctioned adventure, nearly destroys the world, and delivers a speech about how nothing matters while holding a weapon. He has been absent from his daughter's life for 20 years. He slots back into the family garage like someone returning from a long errand, rather than someone who abandoned their child for 2 decades. He is brilliant and chaotic and funny and completely, entirely self-serving in almost every moment. The family around him adjusts to his presence the way people adjust to a natural disaster. Beth is glad he is back in a way that is clearly more about her need for a father than about anything Rick has done to deserve her gladness. Jerry resents him immediately and correctly. Morty is pulled between fear and fascination. Summer barely registers him. Nobody in the pilot treats Rick as a reliable, present, emotionally available person because there is no evidence that he is any of those things. There is only evidence of what he used to be and what chaos he is capable of generating now that he is back. That is the starting point. That is who Rick was in the first episode. Now hold that image and place it next to what Season 8 built. Season 8 Rick cried watching his daughters act like children. He admitted to his grandson that he was lonely as a child and always wanted more love than he got. He tried to build something real with Bug Ann. He went to a family event. He sent a text that said, "Hey," and waited for a response. He allowed a better version of himself to live a happy life in a contained space at the edge of the universe rather than deleting it. He removed his own grief deliberately so he could be more open. The distance between those two people is the distance Levy was talking about, and it is genuinely enormous. Not because Rick has become a gentle, soft-spoken, fully healed version of himself. He has not, and the show would not be honest if it pretended he had. But because the specific ways Rick engages with the people around him have shifted in ways that are real and permanent and built up over 9 seasons of actual change rather than declared change. This distinction matters enormously. Television shows often have characters who announce that they have changed. They give a speech. They make a decision. They tell another character that things are going to be different now. And then, the next episode, they are the same as they always were. Because the show needs them to be the same as they always were in order to keep generating the same kinds of stories. Rick and Morty does not work that way. Rick's changes are not announced. They do not come with speeches. They show up in behavior, in the things Rick does when he is not performing, in the moments that the show catches almost accidentally, in the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does, that has been slowly, quietly narrowing over 9 seasons. The change is real because it is behavioral, not declarative. Rick is not a different person because he said so. He is a different person because he keeps doing things that the Season 1 version of him would not have done. Levy also said something else in that same conversation that connects directly to Season 9. He said he was excited about where the show was taking Rick over the course of the next few seasons. Plural. Not just Season 9. Seasons 9, 10, 11, and potentially beyond. The show has been renewed through Season 12, which means the people making it are operating with a long view. They are not writing Season 9 as a conclusion. They are writing it as a specific chapter in a longer arc, knowing exactly what comes before and having a clear sense of what comes after. That changes how Season 9 should be read. It is not the ending of Rick's philosophical journey. It is the beginning of a new phase of it. The previous phase, which ran from the pilot through Season 8, was about the slow dismantling of the false self Rick had built over 40 years. Each season removed something. The armor got thinner. The walls came down one layer at a time. By the end of Season 8, the dismantling was essentially complete. The grief was gone. The mission was finished. The preserved past had been released. Season 9 is the first season that belongs to the new phase, which means it is less about taking things away from Rick and more about what Rick does with the space those things leave behind. Less demolition, more construction. And construction is genuinely harder for Rick than demolition has ever been. The evidence for this is in the behind-the-scenes discussion about Season 8, where the producers described the season's central focus as the dark side of nostalgia and the relationship between Rick and both versions of Beth. They talked about Rick becoming more of a family man, about him building healthier connections with his daughters and grandchildren, about the season being a genuine return to character-focused storytelling after seasons that had leaned heavily on large connected plots. All of that was described as deliberate and intentional, not something that happened to the show, but something the show was consciously building toward. Season 9 inherits all of that deliberate construction. It also inherits the specific production context that shaped it. The season was written during and after the writers' strike of 2023, which paused production and gave the writers more time to sit with the material before returning to it. Showrunner Scott Marter confirmed in May 2025 that Season 9 was almost entirely into its final production stage, and by July 2025, the voice work was complete. The season was made carefully, with a full awareness of everything that had come before and a clear intention about where things were going. Marter's own statement about Season 9, that it will convince everyone the show still has a full tank of gas, is interesting in the context of Levy's comment about Rick's journey. A full tank of gas, for a show at this stage, does not mean returning to what the show was in its early seasons. It means having enough momentum and enough genuine story left to justify continued investment. And the genuine story left, the story that Levy is excited about and that Marter believes still has enormous energy, is precisely the story of who Rick becomes now that the old version of himself has been fully dismantled. What does a man like Rick build when he finally stops tearing things down? That is the question Season 9 opens with. Not dramatically, not with a speech, not with a moment where Rick sits down and decides to be different. Just in the accumulated weight of where the character has arrived. In farming gear at a school on a Tuesday morning, or in a garage somewhere, with a phone that has an unanswered text on the screen. Or across a dinner table with a family that he has been present for long enough that his absence would now actually be felt. The pilot Rick would not have been missed. Not genuinely. The family had managed without him for 20 years. His presence added chaos and occasional protection, but his absence would not have left a shaped hole in the family, the way a truly present person leaves a shaped hole when they go. Season 9 Rick would be missed, specifically in the exact shape of him. Because he has been present enough, for long enough, in enough of the small moments that add up to a life, that the people around him have built their lives around the fact of him being there. The kids are spoiled because he kept showing up to protect them. Beth has expectations because he has been meeting them often enough to create expectations. Jerry, baffling as it sounds, has been defending Rick. Even if that defense was being fed by Memory Rick's alterations, the fact that it was possible at all says something about how the relationship has shifted. The very long way Levy mentioned is visible in all of those small measurements. Not in a single dramatic episode. In the accumulated weight of 9 seasons of a man slowly learning that being present is harder than being brilliant, and doing it anyway. Season 9 is the first season that gets to find out what Rick does with presence as a permanent condition rather than an occasional choice. What he does when showing up is not the exception, but the default. What he does when ordinary life is not something he is passing through on the way to something more important, but is, in fact, the thing. He has come a very long way from the pilot, and the road ahead is longer and stranger and more honest than anything that came before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Levy's excitement and Martyr's confidence are grounded in something specific, not just a general sense that the show is in good shape, but a particular belief about what the remaining seasons are capable of doing with Rick's character. Part of that belief is built on the understanding that Rick is not simply a nicer version of who he used to be. He still has the mean, he still has the chaos, he still has every instinct that made him Rick Sanchez in the first place. The question Season 9 raises, and the one that the next section has to address directly, is whether those instincts are now a feature or a problem. Whether the mean is still doing something useful, or whether it is running on momentum without a purpose. That tension has a name, and it is one of the most interesting philosophical questions the show has ever set up. Section 11. The mean left in him paradox. Why Rick's cruelty is now philosophically interesting. Scott Martyr said it plainly. Rick still has plenty of mean left in him. That statement was made in the context of reassuring fans that Season 9 was not going to be a soft, defanged version of the show, that the energy was still there, that Rick had not been sanded down into someone pleasant and manageable and easy to be around. The mean was offered as a promise, proof that the show still had teeth, that Rick was still Rick, that the creative team had not mistaken character growth for character removal. The promise is true. The mean is real, and it is going nowhere. But here is the thing about that statement that nobody seems to have looked at closely enough. Martyr was not just describing a personality trait that had survived intact. He was, without necessarily meaning to, identifying the most philosophically interesting tension in Season 9. Because the mean has always existed inside a specific context that gave it meaning, and that context is now gone. The mean is still there, the context is not. And mean without context is a completely different animal than mean with it. In Season 1, Rick's cruelty had a philosophical home. The nihilism provided the framework. If nothing matters, then cruelty is not cruelty. It is just one more meaningless event in an indifferent universe. If caring is weakness, then being unkind is not a moral failure. It is just the logical behavior of someone who has correctly understood how things work. Rick could be cutting and dismissive and genuinely hurtful to the people around him, and the nihilist framework absorbed it all. It said, "Of course he is like this. What else would a person be, once they had seen enough of the universe to understand what it actually is?" That framework is gone now. The nihilism was always a performance built on top of grief, and the grief has been deliberately removed. The philosophical shelter that made the cruelty make sense, that said it was not really cruelty, but logic, has been dismantled along with everything else. So what is the mean now? This is the paradox. The mean in Season 9 is the same behavior operating in a completely different moral context. Rick will still be cutting. He will still be dismissive in ways that land hard on the people he is being dismissive toward. He will still turn authority figures into vegetables and refuse to follow rules he finds arbitrary, and say things that are technically true, but deliberately painful. None of that is going away. But every single instance of it now happens without the philosophical cover that used to absorb it. In Season 1, Rick being cruel to Jerry was the logical behavior of a nihilist. In Season 9, Rick being cruel to Jerry is just a man being cruel to his son-in-law. There is no framework that makes it anything other than what it is. Rick is smart enough to know this. The audience is smart enough to know this. And the show is absolutely smart enough to know this. Which is why the mean being still present in Season 9 is not a sign that nothing has changed. It is actually evidence that the most interesting change of all is still in progress. Because the question is not whether Rick will still be mean. He will. The question is whether Rick, now operating without philosophical cover for the first time, will notice what the mean actually costs. Not what it costs him in terms of relationships damaged or trust broken. He's been aware of those costs for several seasons and made peace with them. What it costs him in terms of the person he is trying to become. The man who cried at his daughters. The man who sent a 2-letter text. The man who was in a garden when his grandkids needed him, which means he was somewhere quiet and present and ordinary before the chaos arrived. That man, and the man who turns people into vegetables without a second thought, are the same person. They are both
Rick Sanchez. Season 9 is the first season where those two versions of the same man have to share a stage, without a philosophical story that explains why they are actually one consistent thing. Look at the sneak peek again with this in mind. Rick turns Principal Vagina into a carrot. Beth tells Rick he has turned Morty and Summer into spoiled people. Rick decides to send them to a camp for spoiled kids. In the span of about 90 seconds, Rick demonstrates both versions of himself completely. He solves the immediate problem in the most aggressively Rick way possible. No patience for authority, immediate action, no apology for the method. And then he engages with Beth's concern, takes it seriously, and responds to it as someone who cares about the outcome for his grandchildren.
The mean and the care exist in the same scene. Neither one cancels the other out. They just sit there together, which is actually a more honest portrait of how people work than most television ever attempts. People are not consistent. They are cruel in some moments and generous in others, and the cruelty and the generosity are not always in opposition. Sometimes they are expressions of the same underlying thing, just pointed in different directions.
Rick's mean has always been directional. It has always targeted specific things: pretense, unearned authority, dishonesty, laziness dressed up as tradition. These targets have not changed in Season 9. What has changed is that the mean no longer has a philosophical story explaining why those targets deserve it. It is now operating on instinct rather than framework. Rick pushes back against these things not because he has reasoned his way to a conclusion about them, but because something in him finds them genuinely intolerable in a way that feels almost physical. That is actually closer to the Cynic tradition than the nihilist one ever was. The ancient Cynics did not construct careful logical arguments for why pretense was bad. They just could not stand it. It was a gut-level response to a specific kind of dishonesty, and they organized their whole lives around the refusal to participate in it. Rick's mean is the same thing. It is not reasoned, it is felt. And feelings, for a man who spent 40 years telling himself that feelings were weakness, are now the only framework he has left. This is what makes the mean paradoxical in Season 9. It was always evidence of feeling, of caring enough to be bothered, of having standards that the world keeps failing to meet, of wanting things to be honest even in a universe that constantly chooses performance over truth. The nihilist story said the mean was logical detachment. The truth is that the mean was always passion. It was always Rick caring enormously about the difference between real and fake, true and performed, genuine and constructed. Season 9 is the first season where that passion cannot be disguised as something else. Rick's cruelty has also always had a specific relationship with the people closest to him that the show has tracked carefully. He has always been hardest on the people he cares about most. Not because he wants to hurt them, because being hard on them is the only way he knows to be close to them without admitting he is close to them. Jerry gets the sharpest edges of Rick's mean, not because Rick is indifferent to Jerry, but because Jerry is family, and family is the category of people Rick is most frightened of being fully seen by. Across the seasons, even that has shifted. The relationship between Rick and Jerry, which spent years being defined almost entirely by Rick's contempt and Jerry's wounded resentment, has quietly changed. By Season 8, Jerry was defending Rick, enthusiastically and repeatedly, even if that defense was being fed by Memory Rick's alterations. The underlying relationship had softened enough that when Memory Rick filled Jerry's mind with warm memories of Rick being present and supportive, Jerry accepted them completely. They felt true. Not just plausible, true. Because on some level, something about the warmth matched what Jerry had been experiencing from the real Rick in recent seasons. The mean has not disappeared from how Rick treats Jerry, but the contempt has lost some of its certainty. Rick is mean to Jerry the way a person is mean to someone they find genuinely frustrating, but have also accepted as a permanent fixture of their world. There is a difference between contempt and exasperation, and the show has been quietly moving Rick from the first to the second without making a speech about it. Season 9 continues this movement. The sneak peek shows Rick arriving at a school to deal with a family problem, which is the behavior of someone invested in the family's well-being. It shows him listening to Beth and taking her concerns seriously, which is the behavior of someone who respects his daughter's judgment.
These are not the behaviors of a man who holds everyone around him in contempt. They are the behaviors of a man who is exasperated by the people he loves and shows up for them anyway. The mean left in Rick is real. It is not going anywhere. But in Season 9, it is doing something philosophically new. It is operating as the raw, unprotected expression of who Rick actually is, rather than as a layer of armor over who Rick is pretending to be. Mean without armor is vulnerable in a way that mean with armor never was. When Rick pushes back against something in Season 9, it is not because his philosophy tells him to. It is because he genuinely cannot stand it. That genuineness, that absence of the protective layer of reasoned detachment, makes every instance of the mean more revealing than anything the show has produced before. A man whose cruelty is philosophical is frightening. A man whose cruelty is honest is something else entirely. Something harder to dismiss. Something that requires more from the people around him, and more from the man himself. Season 9 Rick is the second kind. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The mean, the care, the cynic's instincts, the dismantled grief, the unanswered text, the farming gear, the ant farm at the edge of space. All of it has been building toward a single question that the show has been circling for 9 seasons without fully landing on. Not a question about what Rick does next, or what the adventures will look like, or which enemies will appear. A question about what kind of story this has always been. Whether the show has been telling a story about a man who cannot change, or a story about a man who has been changing so slowly and so painfully and so honestly that most people watching have not noticed how far he has actually come. Season 9 is where the show has to pick one of those answers and defend it. And the evidence it has been stacking for 9 years already points clearly in one direction. Section 12. What Season 9 can't undo, and why that makes it the most important season. Some things cannot be taken back. Not because the show lacks the ability to reset them. Rick and Morty has always had access to every narrative escape hatch imaginable. Alternate timelines, memory wipes, dimensional replacements. The entire multiverse exists as a mechanism for undoing consequences if the writers choose to use it that way. The show has used those mechanisms before, openly and without apology, and it has always been honest about the fact that it was using them. But there are specific things that happened in Season 7 and Season 8 that the show cannot undo without betraying everything it has built. Not cannot in the sense of being technically impossible. Cannot in the sense that undoing them would make the previous 9 seasons meaningless. The difference matters. A show that reverses its most important character moments because they became inconvenient is a show that was never really committed to those moments in the first place. Rick and Morty has earned too much trust for that. The showrunners have been too deliberate, too careful, too aware of what they were building to throw it away for the convenience of a reset. So the things that happened are permanent, and their permanence is what makes Season 9 unlike every season before it. Rick Prime is dead. That is the first permanent thing. The man who killed Diane, who organized Rick's entire existence for 40 years into a single, focused mission of revenge, is gone. He did not escape into another dimension. He was not captured and held somewhere. He was beaten to death in a room, and he is not coming back. The show made this completely clear and has not walked it back. Whatever happens in Season 9 and beyond, Rick does not have a nemesis to hunt. The engine that powered his identity for the majority of the show's run has been switched off permanently. Diane has been erased from Rick's memory. That is the second permanent thing. Not just from the universe, the Omega device handled that, but from Rick's own mind. He made a deliberate choice to remove her, to use a device inside his own psychology to say goodbye to the last version of her that existed anywhere. Memory Diane thanked him for keeping her alive so long. Then she was gone. Rick then erased the memory of doing that too, so he cannot reach back for it when things get hard. The door is not just closed. The door has been removed, and the wall has been rebuilt in front of the space where it used to be. Memory Rick and Memory Diane are living in an ant farm at the edge of space. That is the third permanent thing. Rick knows this happened, or he did know. He then erased the memory of their location from his own mind, which means he cannot find them again. They exist somewhere, happy, unreachable. The better version of Rick, the one bird person always believed was the real one, the one who loved without armor and showed up and stayed, is out there in a small, contained space with the memory of the woman Rick loved, and Rick has made sure he can never go back to it. He gave his better self a happy ending and walked away and closed the door behind him. These three things together form a wall of permanence that Season 9 lives on the other side of. There is no version of the future in which Rick wakes up one morning and his nemesis is alive again, or his memory of Diane is restored, or Memory Rick comes back to fill the gaps in his psychology. The past, as Rick organized himself around it, is genuinely finished. Now consider what this means practically for the show. Executive producer Steve Levy confirmed in September 2025 that production was far ahead of the broadcast schedule. Season 9 was in its final stages, Season 10 was actively being made, and Season 11 was already being written. The show has been renewed through Season 12. The people making Rick and Morty are not operating with the uncertainty of a show that might be canceled next year. They are operating with a clear, long view of where things are going and enough runway to get there properly. This means Season 9 was not written as a conclusion. It was written as a foundation. The permanent things, Rick Prime dead, Diane gone from memory, Memory Rick sealed away, are not the ending of Rick's story. They are the new ground that everything built after them will stand on. Season 9 is the first season constructed entirely on that new ground. Dan Harmon said something that sits at the center of all of this. In discussing what happens after Rick achieved his revenge, Harmon said that he believed there was still a conclusion to a story here, because the person telling himself that destroying things solves problems will eventually have to face the fact that it does not. That is Harmon describing the arc that Season 9 and beyond are responsible for completing. The self-destructive streak has been the engine of the show. The destruction of enemies, of systems, of his own memories, of his own carefully constructed identity. Rick has spent 9 seasons tearing things down. The conclusion Harmon is describing is the one where Rick discovers that the only thing left to build is an actual life. That is what cannot be undone. Not just the specific events, Rick Prime's death, Diane's removal from his memory, but the direction those events established. The show has pointed Rick toward something. It has cleared the ground. It has removed every significant obstacle between Rick and the thing he has been most afraid of for his entire adult life. The obstacles are gone. What is left is the fear itself, standing in an empty room with nothing to hide behind. The fear, as established across 9 seasons of evidence, is simple. Rick is afraid that if he allows himself to fully belong to something, a family, a relationship, a life built around the people he loves rather than around the mission of avenging them, it will be taken from him again. The universe took Diane. Rick Prime used the Omega device to make sure it was total and permanent and without any loophole in the infinite multiverse. If Rick lets himself love something that completely again, the universe has already proven it knows how to take it. This fear is rational. It is based on actual experience. A man who lost everything once and spent 40 years making sure he could never lose everything again is not being irrational when he hesitates to put everything on the table a second time. He is being honest about what the evidence says. But the show, through 9 seasons of carefully stacked behavioral contradictions and small, genuine moments, has been making a different argument. The argument is not that the fear is wrong. The argument is that Rick has been losing things anyway. He lost 20 years with Beth. He lost his relationship with Morty to the accumulated weight of all the times he used Morty as a tool rather than treating him as a person. He lost the possibility of a real relationship with anyone by maintaining the distance required by the casual arrangement. He sent a text that said, "Hey," and got nothing back. The armor did not protect him from loss. It just changed the shape of it. Instead of losing the people he loved to an external enemy with a weapon, he lost them to the distance he kept between himself and everyone. Rick Prime used the Omega device. Rick used detachment. Both of them erased Diane from Rick's life, one from the outside, one from the inside. Season 9 is the first season where that parallel is fully visible. The external threat is gone. The internal one, the habit of distance, the reflexive cruelty, the mean operating without cover, is the only thing left. And it is the harder thing to fight, because you cannot track it through dimensions with a portal gun. You cannot outsmart it with intelligence. You just have to notice it every time it happens and choose differently. Showrunner Scott Marder promised that Season 9 would convince everyone the show still has a full tank of gas. Adult Swim president Michael Aweline described the character writing as some of the best the show has ever done. These are not empty promotional statements from people with something to sell. They are descriptions of what the show is doing with a character who has arrived at the most genuinely interesting moment of his entire arc. The moment when the story he was telling about himself is finished, and the story he has not yet told has to begin. The most important season of any long-running show is rarely the most explosive one.
It is rarely the one with the most dramatic events or the most shocking reversals. The most important season is usually the quiet one, the one that comes after the big things have happened and the character has to live in the landscape those things created. The one that asks, given everything that has happened, who are you now? Season 9 is that season for Rick Sanchez. He cannot go back to hunting Rick Prime. He cannot retreat into the grief that organized his philosophy. He cannot preserve a version of Diane in the back of his mind as a reason to keep running. He cannot use Memory Rick as the part of himself that handles the feelings he cannot. He cannot tell himself that nothing matters, because 9 seasons of his own behavior have made that claim impossible to maintain with a straight face. What he can do, what the show has been slowly, patiently, deliberately giving him the tools to do, is stay. Not perfectly, not gracefully, not without the mean and the chaos and the carrot joke and the farming gear and the portal gun and every other thing that makes Rick Sanchez who he is. But stay. Be present. Show up to the school in the morning. Send the text. Sit at the dinner table. Let the people he loves see him without the armor on and not immediately put it back. He has come a very long way from the pilot. The road ahead is the hardest part. And Season 9 is the first step on it. 12 sections, 9 seasons of evidence. A philosophical arc that started with a drunk man in a garage pointing a weapon at a teenager, and arrived at a man in farming gear turning a principle into a carrot, while actually, genuinely, deeply caring about the outcome for his grandchildren. All of it building toward the same conclusion the show has been pointing at since Bird Person told Morty what Wubba Lubba Dub Dub actually meant. Since Slow Mobius's widow chose love instead of revenge at a bar on the other side of the galaxy. Since Rick sat in a chair and watched his family have dinner with a face that said everything he had never been willing to say out loud. The conclusion is not complicated. It was never complicated. It just took 9 seasons of a very smart, very broken, very slowly healing man to get close enough to say it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.